Hi, everyone. My name is Julianne DiCocco, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about promoting inclusion and equity through the use of trauma-informed practices in the school setting. Currently, I work as the manager of student support services for Union School District in Santa Clara County, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about my background and my history before kind of jumping into information. So a little bit about me. For the last 12 years, I've been working in public education all over California. I worked in Washington, I've worked in Hawaii, and I've worked primarily in low socioeconomic schools, low performing schools. I worked for Compton Unified School District and Long Beach Unified for a handful of years. So I have a really diverse background in public education, always through the lens of behavior analysis, consulting with teachers, consulting with students. And so that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 12 years. Currently, I'm in a doctoral program, getting my doctorate in applied behavior analysis. And I've been a BCBA for the last 8 years. I've been certified since 2012. And like I said, currently I work for Union School District as the manager of student support services. I'm a trauma-informed practitioner, which basically just means I've gone to many trainings and have, really immersed myself in the world of better understanding trauma and better understanding ways to infuse trauma practices into the school environment to serve all of our students. And when I'm not working in the school setting, I'm also a trauma-informed yoga and meditation teacher. Primarily, I work at various correctional facilities, both men, women, and juveniles. Currently, pre-COVID, I was working at Salinas State Prison for Men, as well as San Quentin up in Northern California, a little bit north, teaching a weekly yoga and meditation class to incarcerated men. And then most recently, I was a foster parent to a 15-year-old who was living with us for the last year. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And still am able to maintain a pretty longevity connection with his two sisters. And again, I'm gonna dive into that a little bit more when we talk about why I do this work and why it means so much to me. I just always like to start a little bit by talking about my story. So in these pictures, you see me and my siblings and my sister and my 3 brothers. When people look at these pictures or people think about, what is going on with a family, I think people see seemingly a typical family and people who, we went on vacations together and we were incredibly close. But what people often didn't see and what I really didn't start talking about was the abuse and trauma that all of us were exposed to when we were growing up. I was raised in a household with a lot of physical aggression, a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of emotional neglect. And all of us kind of suffered in different ways from the behaviors of the adults that we were in, we were in their care. So many of us came out of it being pretty impacted by that. I know me personally, I kind of took on this role of the fixer where I was the youngest and I kind of just wanted to make sure everybody was okay and everybody was safe and would run myself kind of ragged, taking care of everybody else but myself. And over years, it definitely took a toll on me, and I started to have some pervasive panic attacks and anxiety attacks and really suffer with depression and anxiety. And still something that I struggle with quite a bit. I have a really hard time with trust. I have a really hard time forming relationships with people. And that really all speaks to the circumstances in which I was raised in. In comparison to my siblings, I made it out a little bit, better than some of my brothers and sisters. Two of my siblings have really severe substance problems, and have, been on and off substance users, primarily intravenous drugs, for 20 plus years. So that's something. And when I talk a little bit about trauma, you'll see how the statistics of trauma, they're very tangible and very real, because I see it in my own family. My sister has profound mental health issues and major suicidal ideation, and something that she still in her 40s continues to struggle and battle every day. And, we can all kind of speak to the behaviors that we were exposed to and the environment we were exposed to as kids, really, really shaping how we kind of showed up at school, how we showed up in life, how it's impacted our relationships with each other. And, I wish when I was a kid that I had people in schools who reached out and asked me how I was, and checked up on me, because, being the fixer and being the role that I kind of assigned for myself, I never had anybody really checking in on me and making sure that I was okay. And I kind of pretended like everything was fine and everything was perfect, and that we were all this big happy family. And that caught up to me. And that's a really big reason why I do this work, and why I believe so strongly in being trauma informed, and why I always share my story, because you never really know who's struggling, and you never really know who needs the extra little help, or who needs that extra little bit of love. And I can tell you, I think it would have made a really big difference for me in my adulthood if I had some more people kind of show up for me. And so I've dedicated my career to really just trying to be that connection and trying to be that person for our students. So that's a little bit about my story, which also goes into my why. That top picture, and the boy with the blue hoodie, and then the boy reaching for the books, that was my foster son, who lived with us for the last year. He was a former student of mine, and him, and then the young woman on the bottom right corner in the graduation gown, and then the picture above that, they're all siblings. And so for the last year, I have helped support this entire family, and they've all become part of our family. And, while we had just the one of them living with us, the young man living with us, who, like I said, was one of my former students, we have taken on the role of being these kids' bonus mom and bonus dad. And all three of these kids have gone through a tremendous amount of trauma. When we talk about ACEs, all three of these kids have ACEs scores of 10. And again, if you're unfamiliar with ACEs, or if you are familiar, you understand what that means. And if you're not, you'll understand what it means shortly. And all of these kids have so many troubles in their life, maintaining positive relationships, seeking meaningful connection. The young man who up until recently lived with us had significant emotional outbursts and had such a high level of need that eventually his trauma kind of won for right now. And he ended up currently leaving our home to seek a life that is nothing that will really benefit him. He's currently on the run, trying to fulfill his desire to be on the streets, still trying to kind of wrap our brain around all of that. But it really speaks to the level of trauma and just how much it impacts you. And even though we have been this boy's lifeline for the last year, it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of energy, but this is what keeps me going, because I can also speak to the amazingness of the young woman who's 18 and just graduated high school and is going to college and calls me 17 times a day asking about, what classes should she take, and to help her with, APA guidelines when she's writing a paper, or, she has boy problems and she talks to me, and she is such a success story to having a connection, having stability, and that trauma doesn't define you. And unfortunately, the young man who was living with us and his younger sister have a lot more work to do and have a longer journey ahead of them. And but that's what keeps us going. We're going to continue to be here for these 3 kids as long as they'll allow us to be. And really, truly, this is my why. I've experienced the trauma. I want to help kids who have had the trauma, and I hope that every kid at least is able to feel loved and valued in the time that I have with them, whether it be a student or it be somebody who's living in my home, or somebody who lives 8 hours away who FaceTimes me and calls me 15 times a day. So that's a little bit about me and my why, which I think is really important when we're talking about trauma work. If you have a connection to it, that we're honest about it and we speak to it, because it affects you for the rest of your life. And so I always want to share a little bit about that. And so what are the objectives rather for this training? To gain a basic understanding of trauma, both the science and the impact it has, understanding what trauma might look like to some of the students that we serve, and learn a bunch of different ways to support our learners who have experienced trauma. So jumping right in, what is trauma? So trauma is ultimately an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. This then activates a stress response in our brain. Many of you have heard fight, flight, or freeze response, and we'll show examples of that in a little bit. And this is compounded in children when an adult is not present, and shuts down the part of our brain that is responsible for rational thought. So if you see, we have these 3 states. We have the executive state, which is in our prefrontal lobes, which is always, what can I learn from this, or what is happening? The emotional state, which is in our limbic system. Am I loved? Can this person love me? Does this person love me back? And then survival state, which is, am I safe? And kids who have experienced trauma typically are living in that survival state. Everything that they do, every decision that they make is just to try and seek safety. Whereas everything else, the what can I learn from this and am I loved, that's secondhand, because over time these are kids who have repeatedly maybe not felt that love, or haven't been able to trust that love, or have a hard time understanding, well, what is the point of all of this? Or what is the, when we talk about executive functioning, what is the why, and what is the perspective, and what is the outcome that this is going to lead to? These kids aren't thinking like that. They're thinking, how am I going to survive? And how am I going to know that I'm going to be okay? And when you live in that state, it can show up in a lot of different ways. And again, we'll dive into that a little bit more. It's not the event itself that makes trauma, that makes something traumatic rather, but the impact of the event and how our body and brain experienced and internalized the event at that time. Complex trauma, which is repeated and multiple experiences with either one traumatic event or multiple traumatic events, is when we experience multiple traumatic events, often involving the caregiving system that is supposed to care for us and keep us safe. So thinking about the kids that we have a lifelong connection to in the foster care system, all 3 of these kids experienced an incredible amount of abuse in their homes. And in theory, your home is supposed to be a place of safety and love and protection, but instead this was the place that they were getting physically abused, verbally abused. They were displaced from their homes, many or multiple times, and witnessed drug use, and had a parent who was incarcerated, or sometimes both parents who were incarcerated. And so the more events that kind of lead up, the more and more that home is not a refuge, is not a place that's safe for them. It is the place that's associated with something traumatizing. And so our worldview and sense of self becomes incredibly impacted. because all of our resources can continue to go back and experience this when we've been triggered. And so some of you might have heard about adverse childhood experiences. It's called the ACEs study, and this is something that came out of Kaiser Permanente about 20 years ago or so, that looked at what is the impact of adverse childhood experiences on health of patients, primarily is what they were looking at. And so if we look at this, first let's start at looking at what are adverse experiences. Well, we look at them in 3 different categories. You have abuse, which can be emotional, physical, or sexual. You have household challenges, which can be domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation or divorce, an incarcerated parent, and then you have a neglect, which can be emotional neglect or physical neglect rather. So individuals who have 6 or more ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. So let that sink in for a moment. Additionally, 1/8 of the population have more than 4 ACEs. And again, like I said earlier, the kids in my care and the kids that I have that connection to all have an ACEs score of 10. So just think about the outcomes for them. Me personally, my ACEs score is a 7. So think about what is the impact of trauma and all of these events, and just see, just by the sheer fact that I experienced these things, I'm more likely to have a shorter life expectancy on top of all of these other things. So on the top of this, you'll see, that you're 3 times more likely to develop, a lung disorder, suicidal ideation. You're more likely to develop depression, to have liver disease, to use intravenous drugs, pregnancy, and the risk of having a child or becoming sexually active. So all of these things, all of these numbers, if you didn't know about it, or even if you did know about it, every time I talk about this or every time I see this, just the fact that you could have 4 or more of these ACEs, which again, 1/8 of the population have, you're more likely for all of these really what we would consider horrible things that can happen to you just because of somebody else's actions in your life. Adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. So it wasn't until this ACEs study that we started to look at trauma. This wasn't something that physicians were ever asking. This wasn't something that teachers were ever trained on. And so we didn't know any of this information. And now that we know this information, what can we do? Because at least 67% of the population have at least 1 ACE. And while you could have 1 ACE or 6 ACEs or 4 ACEs, it can still impact you in such a harmful way for yourself that we really need to look at this, and this really needs to inform the lens in which we look at our students. And then lastly, if you look at this little pyramid, you have this adverse childhood experience, you have this disrupted neurodevelopment. I always, I have the educational rights of 2 of those kids, the one who was living with us and his younger sister. And I would always tell people, if you did a brain scan of my boy's brain compared to somebody else his same age who didn't have trauma, their brain is going to look completely different because of the development of executive functioning, because of the survival state that he is constantly in. And that is just because it happened for so many years over such a course of time that his brain developed differently. You have social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. Then you start to have this adoption of risky health behaviors. Then you could have disease, disability, social problems, and ultimately it could lead to an early death. And I don't say this to scare anybody. I don't say this because this slide is like a doom and gloom type of slide, but I say it because it needs to be spoken about, and we need to be honest with ourselves, and we also need to really think about the kids that are in our classrooms, or even the parents that we're interacting with and the staff that we're interacting with on a daily basis, that we don't know what that person has experienced. And if we kind of look through the lens that they could have experienced one of these things, and that many of them have experienced multiple things, how can we inform our practices, and how can we cultivate a more accepting, inclusive, equitable environment for everybody? So what can we take away from this study? Well, we can look at ways to prevent trauma. So, looking at interventions in the community, look at programs, look at funding, easier said than done, especially right now, but we do need to kind of look at what can be done so that this is a preventative intervention and not necessarily something that, the trauma has already happened and now we need to, problem solve for in that moment. Obviously, that's an incredibly hard thing to prevent when you're talking about, homelessness and incarceration and drug use. But I think a lot of it could start with early education, early intervention supports to families, especially those who might be more at risk to experience adverse experiences. We can screen for trauma to inform our medical and educational practices. We're already doing this, but not every hospital, not every doctor, not every school has instituted trauma-informed care. And then one big takeaway is that we can just kind of assume that many kids in our class and within our schools have experienced and are impacted by trauma in some way. This whole COVID-19 situation is incredibly traumatizing for our kids. They are going to come back to school with potentially have experienced trauma, or just the event itself of being removed from your daily schedule and your social environment could be traumatizing for some of our kids. I also know from conversations I've had with our social worker that the increase of CPS calls during COVID has gone up exponentially because you have parents who are at home with their kids all day, and kids are having behaviors, and parents are at home sheltering in place with their families, and people are reaching a breaking point a lot faster. And not that necessarily means that we should be engaging in abusive or neglectful behaviors, but it's been happening at a much higher rate than it was prior to the shelter in place. And so that's something just to kind of think about as well. And I don't have the statistic on that. I only know from the social workers that I've spoken to and our own caseworker that's a really big problem that they've been facing since March. Okay, so how does this impact trauma in schools? Well, trauma is common, pervasive, and too often goes unaddressed because of the complexity of behaviors and the overshadowing of other diagnoses that don't necessarily address the trauma itself. When an individual at a school is linked to the idea of safety, particularly during these critical years of development, we have this power to rewire the brain through the sense of connection and safety that we instill in our classrooms. So what does trauma look like? Well, they can be a wide range of things. It can be intense and ongoing emotional upset, depressive or anxiety symptoms, behavioral changes, difficulties with self-regulation, problems relating to others or forming healthy attachments, regression or loss of previously acquired skills, attention and academic problems, inability, learning disabilities, or just having a hard time accessing the educational curriculum, somatic complaints, feeding issues, hoarding behaviors, and that's just to name a few. Speaking to the young man who lived with us for the last year, part of the reason why my husband and I went through with the crazy idea of fostering a 15-year-old was he attached to me pretty quickly. He knew that he could trust me. I was somebody at school who was feeding him, and I was somebody at school who was checking in on him, and I was somebody at school who let him know that he was safe, and he would stay after school with me, or he would even wait sometimes in the morning to say good morning to me. And he attached, and it wasn't until he lived with me that we saw that Sometimes he was very healthily attached to me, but then sometimes he was also incredibly unhealthily attached to me, where he would make it so that because he did trust me so much, that he would also hurt me the most. And that was really hard, and I didn't really fully understand that. Even though I know this literature intimately, it was hard to kind of experience it. He had such a hard time forming a healthy relationship with me and sustaining it over time, that's a big reason why he ended up leaving our care. I also saw lots of hoarding behaviors. I would never be able to find any of my cleaning supplies. I could never find any of the snacks that I just bought. I couldn't find my dog toys because he would keep my dog in there for hours at a time, because he wanted to snuggle and sleep on the bed with our dog. And so, everybody shows up differently, and a lot of these behaviors can also sometimes be associated with other disorders or with other developmental or mental health issues. But having, again, an understanding of knowing who has experienced trauma, screening for that trauma, can really help us not only intervene on the behaviors, but doing so in a trauma-informed way. Something that I really like is this idea of the language of flipping their lid. Oftentimes kids who have experienced trauma will quote unquote flip their lid. And this basically just means that they've been triggered. And whatever that traumatizing event is, it can be a loud noise, it can be a certain smell. I know our son, for a while, anytime he would see a police officer, anytime he would hear a siren, his pupils would get huge, and he would immediately look over at me, and he would assume that something had happened to him, or that I called the cops on him, or that somebody called the police on him, or that the police were going to get him, even though the siren was miles away. That was very triggering for him. And oftentimes when he would do that, we would then see a major regression in his ability to cope and handle smaller situations, because it triggered a traumatic response for him. When this happens, the frontal lobe, which we talked about earlier, goes offline, and you go into that survival mode. And this happens because it is what their brain has been trained to do to survive. It adapts to the response, and it's a normal response to an abnormal experience, which in this case is the trauma. So some triggers and responses. So earlier we talked about flight, fight, and freeze. So here are some common trauma triggers: unpredictability or sudden change, transition, a loss of control, feeling vulnerable, lonely, or rejected, absence or loss of staff or peers, sensory overload, a confrontation, sometimes even praise, intimacy, and a positive attention. When our boy got placed with us, he used to love hugs. We used to do this thing when he was in juvenile hall, and we used to talk all the time prior to him living with us. We would hang up every call and go, okay, big hug, because we couldn't give each other a big hug. And when he first got placed with us, every single night when I would say goodnight, we'd be able to actually engage in that big physical big hug. And then about 4 or 5 months in, and this was, pre-COVID, he started saying, no, don't hug me. He refused to let me hug him. And there was something about him forming a healthy attachment to me and him trusting me that was so scary for him that he actually stopped hugging me. And, if I was lucky, I got 1 hug a week, where I used to get 2-3 hugs a day from him when he first lived with us. So that was just kind of interesting to kind of see. And so based on whatever that trigger was, if someone is experienced that trauma through flight, they might withdraw, they might leave the class, they might skip the class, they might kind of zone out, they might act very sleepy or pretend to sleep, they might avoid other people, they might hide or wander, they might get more easily frustrated or discouraged. Fight, you might see that. You see that more like overt behaviors, acting out, behaving aggressively, acting silly, defiance. Our kid was the king of defiance, was just constantly would argue over the color of the sky with me just to fight. Hyperactivity, arguing, screaming, and yelling. And then freeze. exhibiting numbness, refusing to answer, refusing to get their needs met, sometimes just kind of not responding at all, giving kind of a blank look, an inability to be able to move or act. And so we don't really know how someone's going to respond. And someone might respond, the same student or the same child might respond in a flight to some situations, in a fight to some, in a freeze to others, or kind of vacillates between engaging in these common responses. But these are all ways in which our kids can engage in behavior based on a traumatic trigger that they have experienced. I want to just take a moment and think about mirror neurons as we're going to start talking about some interventions and some ways to support these kids. Our emotional networks know what we see others feeling and doing. And so this can not only impact how the child who's experiencing the trauma might normalize or understand the trauma, but it can also help when that child is experiencing something traumatic, that if we model an appropriate response, that child might be able to start mirroring that response. So think about a situation when you're at work or you're at home. I'll use a home example. When my husband comes home and he has a grumpy day at work and, you know, he's all like, you know, dark cloud over his head for the whole day, I could be having a great day, but the minute he gets home, I start to notice that my mood has changed. I'm feeling a little bit more negative. I'm feeling like maybe now I have a great head over my head. And so I think we've all experienced that. We kind of pick up the energy, the vibe, the behaviors of those around us. And so for a kid who's experienced trauma, if you are in an environment where the response to that trauma is, you know, an overt behavior like defiance or aggression, then that becomes normalized to that individual. But if they're in an environment where the response to that is, let's take a breath, let's breathe, we can take a walk, let's get a drink of water, we can actually model an appropriate response for our students. And so that's called a neuron. And I find that really fascinating, the science behind all of that. I won't have any more slides because I think the science is actually way more complicated than I probably speak to. But it's something, you know, definitely to consider. So then what can we do? Well, humans are hardwired for connection and belonging, and this can be hard to see at times as students who need us the most are often the ones who will push us away the hardest. And they do this with good reason, because adults have been unsafe, unpredictable, or unstable for too long. And we're experiencing that right now. As heartbreaking as it is to know that my 15-year-old that I have poured my love and energy into for the last year has fled to go live a life that is not going to help them in any way and will ultimately lead to some pretty serious negative impacts. That is what he's more used to. He is more used to pushing a safe relationship away. He is more used to chasing the chaos. But if there's one thing we know that he'll be able to come back and realize that he was loved, that he was safe. But these kids, oftentimes, it takes way longer than a year, and it takes way longer than we could ever imagine for that individual to come to terms with their trauma and also be able to do what they need to do to manage that trauma. But for that year, he knew that he was loved. He knew that he was safe. And there were so many moments that he'd allow himself to be open to that. But then he'd kind of freak himself out and be like, oh, no, I can't trust you guys. And I don't want to be, this isn't safe. And this is too predictable. Because in the past, when things were good, ultimately something negative always happened, or something bad would happen, and it was like he was just waiting for something bad to happen. And that just shows you, again, that survival brain and that idea of constantly wondering if you're safe and constantly wondering if you're going to be okay. And so knowing that we're hardwired for connection and belonging, this is where we as a school system, and this is where we have kids for 5 years, 6 years, or 3 years in the middle school, right? In high school, we have them for 4 years, sometimes longer. And we can be a constant for a handful of kids or one kid, and we can be that one loving connection to a child with trauma over a prolonged period of time. So it's just something to think about. So one of the first things that I like to talk about now, kind of jumping into strategies, is always empower, never disempower. So avoiding those power struggles, giving structured choices, rewarding the effort, and continuing to reinforce what you want to see happening. Praise the positives. Use that, 10-to-1 ratio of, 10 positive, 10 positives, and, for every one negative. Really avoiding that power struggle and not getting into that battle, and just constantly letting that individual know that you see them trying, you see them, you know that it's hard, and just constantly reinforcing the effort can make such an impact on kids who have experienced trauma. The next one that I'll talk about is unconditional positive regard. And so as a behavior analyst, I'll be honest, this is this is developed by Carl Rogers, who is on the complete opposite end of the psychology, on the meter when we're looking at a behaviorist versus someone who's more humanistic in nature. And I can tell you, as someone who is a pretty stringent behaviorist, this stuff works. And it really is just about showing up. Traumatic events make it difficult for children to trust. They make it difficult to feel worthy, take initiative, and form relationships. Students dealing with this trauma don't need another person telling them that something that they're doing is wrong. They need to know how to get help. They need sustained kindness, someone who will empathize with them, who will show them that they can get through challenges at home and school. And this can be communicating respect even when it's not returned. Think about students who are saying some of the most horrible things in your face, calling you all of these names. And again, it's that power struggle. Like, take a breath and just say, hey, I can see you're having a hard moment. I'm sorry you're feeling sad. I'm sorry you're feeling mad. I'll come back in a couple of moments, instead of calling them a name back or giving them a nasty look or changing your whole body posture to something like this, or furrowing your eyebrows. Communicating that respect and always showing that dignity and respect can go a really long way. Showing kindness verbally and non-verbally, whether that be having like a handshake with a student, having a certain smile, having an activity that you guys do together. Just simply a smile can go such a long way. Model this to the whole class, even when the student isn't in the classroom. So again, just always showing that that child has a place in your room. And even if things get kind of bad for a little bit and the kid has an explosive behavior in the classroom, that when they come back and they're calm, they're always welcomed in that classroom. And that you're not, every day is a reset. Every moment can be a reset. And that you're there to just unconditionally care and provide love and comfort and safety to that student. Avoid sarcasm. And most importantly, don't take it personally. I mean, we're all human. We're going to take some things personally. Everybody has their breaking point, but it's recognizing when you do that and recognizing, ooh, I probably shouldn't have done that. Or, oh man, I really allowed him calling me stupid 300 times today. Really get the best of me. It's showing up the next day with that big smile, ending the day with that, hey, let's try again tomorrow. Having that kindness and that unconditional positive regard can be so incredibly meaningful for kids who experience trauma. Having realistic expectations. And so this is kind of for every student, but the whole idea being, let's make sure that the expectations we have are achievable. We don't want to send this negative message that, you are too damaged to behave, or you're different than the others, so I'm giving up on you. Kids are already feeling kind of powerless who have experienced trauma. They're always trying to seek control. And anytime that they're feeling like that, it can trigger trauma. And so having some limits around routines and sending the message that we can have expectations for these students, but they have to be manageable. And over time, the expectations can become bigger and bigger, or it can become more and more. We have to start small and eventually grow as that child. One feels safe, one knows that you're trustworthy of them, and more importantly, so that they can feel success, so that they can gain access to that positive reinforcement and gain access to feeling good, so that then they can, in the next time, if you do increase the expectation a little bit, they've already know that you have their back, and they already know, hey, I can do this. So if you start with something that they're not going to be able to do, it can potentially snowball and trigger something for them that, it'll not only impact the relationship you have with that student, but it'll also impact the way that they feel about themselves. Check your assumptions, observe and question. Every time we catch ourselves making an assumption, we choose to make an observation instead. Based on observations, we can ask questions. It's only worthwhile to ask a question, though, if we're willing to listen carefully to that response. So listen to the response. Listen to what the student is saying. And do so in a way where we're making them feel relevant, and we're displaying that respect or that unconditional positive regard. Don't turn the small things into big things. I have the saying, and I'm sure most of you who work in education have heard, we're having a really big reaction to a small little problem. That applies to this as well. Don't sweat the small stuff. Don't take it personal. And don't allow something, even if it is something kind of big, don't allow that to completely negatively impact your relationship and future interactions with that student. Always looking for what is the, functional communication behind the behavior. We know that behaviors have functions, and we also know that often behavior is serving as a form of communication. And it's way easier for even a student who is verbal to say something in defiance, or say something aggressive, or even, just like blurt out, and then to stop, take a pause, and think about what their response should be. And so if we kind of look through our kids through that lens, then we understand, okay, that kid was being defiant, he was blurting out. Well, what was he really trying to say, or what was really going on? Can make a significant difference in how we look at the behaviors of our students. Beware of projecting adult language and intention to a child's behavior. This is that whole concept of, not seeing things objectively and not subjectively. If we place a certain label on a student and say, oh, that kid's defiant, or that kid's annoying, or that kid's acting a certain way, we can then believe that the words that we've projected on that student are actually true. And that over time can actually make us forget this is a child who's experienced an incredible traumatic event or multiple traumatic events in their life. So looking through the lens of what is it that the student needs, what is happening in this moment, what can I do to help them, versus, oh, this is just the kid's having a bad day and he's gonna go. And that happens through giving time and space. Just like when we get upset, and I know when I come home, I need at least 20 minutes before I'm ready to talk to anybody. Don't try and talk to me when I first come home from work, because I usually need some time to decompress. And so do our kids. If they had a really rough morning, if they were triggered, if they were just having a day where they are feeling just not good for whatever reason it might be, give them time and give them space. Give them that unconditional positive regard. Have them feel meaningful in your classroom. Give them something to do, and start small with the expectations. It'll all be okay. And that child will be way more receptive to that than trying to push through it, or, again, us projecting any bit of language or assumption about what's happening with that student. I kind of talked about this a little bit, helpful participation. So kids like to feel belonged. They like to feel that they're heard, that they can make choices, that they have responsibilities. some form of problem solving can be incredibly engaging for students. When we participate, kids feel that they belong. When they are contributing to the welfare of others, this can improve their own feelings of self-worth. All of us are working in education in some capacity, and I think we all feel pretty good at the end of the day when we stop and take a pause and reflect that we're really helping, I would suppose, bare bones, we're helping kids. And that makes us feel good. It makes us feel good that we are helping our students learn and gain knowledge and access the educational environment. It's the same thing for our students. It helps them build resiliency. And we can do this by just simple things in the classroom. Find something exciting for them to do. They can be the classroom helper, and they can have a job. They can run an errand for you. Anything that you can think about. Think outside the box. And once kids start to shift the focus from inward to outward, it helps them cultivate sympathy for other people. It helps them see that the love and the care and the energy that they're receiving is okay, and that it's okay to give that out to other people. That is how you start to build trust. That is how you build reciprocity. And so something as simple as having the student with, who's experienced some of the trauma to be the person who takes the attendance, every day, or has a note that they bring to a teacher, or is the person who does the flag salute or whatever it might be, and rotating that because you want it to be equitable for the other students as well. But giving them something to do and giving them a special job has them feel part of the community, and also that sense of belonging, and that they have a purpose, and that they have responsibilities in the classroom, and that'll help them feel safe in that classroom environment. These are just some ways, staying calm and acknowledging the situation that's happening. These are some terms that I have used. I've also used them in my home quite a bit. It looks like you need some time. I'm here when you're ready. It looks like you had a rough morning. How can I help you? Or how are you? Let me know when you're ready to rejoin class, if that's a student who you've been able to get them successfully to take a break. When they do come back, thank you for communicating with me. I am here for you. Instead of get out of my class, or you've got to go, or someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or whatever it is they might say, a simple statement can go a long way. And these are just some examples of acknowledging and also staying calm. It goes back to that neurons idea. If we stay calm and we model the language that we want our students to be able to receive and maybe potentially even use in their own lives, they're going to be way more receptive to them. So if we put out calm, the students in our classroom and the student who's experiencing the trauma are going to be more likely to be calm. If we meet an erratic behavior or a destructive behavior with negativity or a heightened sense as the adult, it's going to keep getting heightened, and it's going to take longer for that person to, de-escalate or diffuse. Another thing that I really like is talking about safety and talking about expectations, and this can be both the whole class and the individual. So, your whole class, all children will be safe to learn. And so having lessons and talking about what does safe behavior look like? Because the same expectation for all of your students, it can be targeting the 1 or 2 students in your classroom who might be engaging in more behavior. But the idea is that we talk about it as a whole classroom, and we all hold each other accountable. We all meet each other with kindness and empathy and compassion. One way you can do that is creating a calm or peaceful corner in the classroom for all the students to access, and I'll show an example of that in a moment. If we have kids that we know might need a specific plan, you can create a safety plan with that student that's just simple. What can you do when you're feeling a certain way? Where can you go? And then how are we going to know when you're ready to join? Now, this can be, something that you create. It can be with, mental health therapists or social workers, school psychologists, whoever it is on your school site. But it doesn't have to be this big, thorough, step-by-step plan. It really just is about getting the needs met of that student. So what can you do? Where can you go? And how am I going to know that you're ready? And then it teaches that child coping skills as well. Here's just an example of some peace corners and some examples of things you can do, having like plush little fluffy toys, having some tool that they can, that they can trace and breathe with, having toys that they can manipulate and play with. And you can have calming things, books that they can look at, access to things to listen to. And so really just a safe place that any kid who needs a moment, or any kid who needs a little extra time, or, needs just to be away from the group, but still in the safe environment of the classroom, you can create these in really easy, meaningful ways. I know we're all doing distance learning right now, but especially when kids do come back, I really encourage you guys to think about having these things in your classrooms, having calming tools and having a calm box and having a corner where kids can diffuse, unplug, reset, but still be in the safety of the environment that makes them feel good, and with the whole classroom that's inclusive, instead of sending them out of the classroom and treating the behavior as something that warrants a discipline or something that warrants a punishment. Teaching coping strategies. So here I've just listed some, there's countless, but breathing, counting, having a mindfulness meditation, listening to music, squeezing something soft, reading a book, going for a walk, drawing, running an errand for the teacher, getting a drink of water, having a snack. And so again, if we teach a strategy when the child is triggered or is having a moment, instead of utilizing a punitive measure, we're teaching them over time that you can get through it and it is okay. And I'm here to help you with that. And you always have a place back in our classroom, and you're always welcome back here. You just, let us work on a plan to get you to feel better about being here today, and that might also mean that after they've taken a break, that we have completely reduced the expectations, because we're going to be realistic with our expectations, and we're going to start small and we're going to build them up so that they immediately feel success after having something happen to them that made them feel, have an emotional response, or made them shut down, or, however it was that they responded to that trauma. And then I just wanted to quickly, you could do a whole presentation on the school to prison pipeline, and I'm sure people at this conference are talking about that, but there is a direct link, and I know I've kind of touched upon it really briefly, and I'm not going to talk about this for long, because again, it could be a whole hour long talk in itself. If we treat trauma and the behaviors that are a manifestation of that trauma through the lens of disciplinary measures, suspensions, behavior referrals, getting sent out of the classroom, parent call, or whatever it might be, caregiver call, we're not teaching the student anything. We're not teaching them a coping strategy. We're not teaching them inclusivity. We're not teaching them that school is safe. We're pairing school with just another environment that bad things can happen to them. And I understand there are behaviors that obviously we do need to be addressed with a higher level of discipline, and working with your teams on what that looks like. But really looking at the child through the lens of the why and the what and the how can we help can make such a big difference. If we are punishing students and suspending them for behaviors they engage in that are a result of their trauma, they have more days of school that are absences. We can also be putting them back into the environment that the trauma has occurred. They sometimes then are missing, when they're missing school, they end up losing, time of instruction. And these are kids who already might have a really challenging time accessing the educational environment and have some delays with, their neurodevelopment, where they need extra supports to be able to access school and all the academic expectations. And so a lower grade point average can lead to a higher risk of dropout. And then we all know that dropping out can lead to a increased risk of imprisonment. The whole idea here being that we want to keep kids at school, and we want to, one, have school be safe, one, also have school be an environment where kids can learn how to work through their trauma, can work through some of this stuff, and that we're not sending them right back to the very environment that might be the reason why they're experiencing this trauma. We want school to be paired as a positive, and we want kids to like coming to school. And again, going back to that, you can be that one person for that child is so incredibly powerful that they might come to school solely because of that smile you gave them in the hall. And if we keep sending kids out of our classrooms, keep sending them, to the principal's office, or having a slew of behavior referrals, or, detention and suspensions, we are ultimately sending them potentially on a path where they're going to end up not liking school, giving up on school, and might engage in behaviors that will likely lead them to potential incarceration as kids. And so again, I could go into this quite a bit, and this is a nice little visual that just really simply breaks down the school to prison pipeline, but there's so much more to dig in here. But there is a component of it that is related to trauma, because the behaviors that the kid engages in because of the trauma can sometimes be incredibly detrimental and can put the child who is engaging in the trauma at risk, and can also, impact the safety of the classroom. But working through it and looking as a collective way to target trauma and an individual way can make such an impact and has greater implications for the child in their educational career. This is just some resources that I like. There's a Hearts curriculum out of UCSF that's really awesome. I don't know if you guys are going to have the ability to click on links, but if you are, this is great. But if you can't, I'll click over it real quick. And it's hearts.ucsf.edu/resources. And that has a plethora of information, and their resources page just has countless things that you can click on and resources for trauma-informed classrooms. And then there's also the Mental Health Administration, Health Services Administration, and that's samhsa.gov. And there's an entire section that looks just at child abuse, child trauma, and has trainings and has free resources to better understand trauma rather. These are some books I really have enjoyed. Both, The Body Keeps the Score is a really good understanding of trauma and the impact of it and how to heal trauma. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog is an incredibly powerful book, again, talking about trauma and the implications of trauma. This is a book specifically on ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences. I think it does a really good job of talking about how the ACEs study came about, the implications of that study, and how to heal, some of the trauma that individuals have experienced, and future ideas of where we can take that. And that's written by Dr. Nadine Harris, who's actually the Surgeon General of the state of California. She also has a really great TED Talk. And if you look up Nadine Harris, YouTube, TED Talk, she has a great talk on trauma that can be really informative. And then these two other books, Fostering Resilient Learners and 101 Trauma-Informed Interventions, are really great tool books, for trauma-sensitive classrooms and having trauma-informed interventions. So what are the big takeaways from this? The impact of trauma is not that child's destiny. Kids can heal, and you can be a part of that healing. You can be that connection and safety for a student, and school and the entire school environment can be that place that that child wants to come to because they feel safe and loved and connected. And that can go such a long way with kids. And then we can equip kids with the tools they need to heal and to grow, to be able to access the lives that they deserve. So by teaching those coping strategies, by doing all of the, unconditional positive regard, having meaningful participation in the classroom, setting expectations that are realistic, teaching coping strategies, having a peace corner, whatever it might be that you take away from this presentation, teaching kids skills and giving kids the tools that they need to better be able to manage their trauma instead of punishing the behaviors that result because of the trauma, can really help these kids access the lives that all of them deserve, especially, the ones who have been through tremendous amount of trauma in their lifetime. And so that is all I have for you guys today. Here is my email. You're always more than welcome to email me if you have any questions about trauma, if you have any questions about fostering, and what that process is kind of like. And I'm happy to talk about our experience with that, because they do go hand in hand in terms of being trauma informed in the foster care system. If anybody's interested in talking about, yoga in a prison or whatever types of things like that, or you want more tools and resources, again, this is a topic that we could talk about for 8 hours and do a whole 2-day seminar on it. So hopefully you have found this helpful. And then if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to stick around and talk through some of that. And then here are my references. Thank you so much.